The wind howled across the Montana plains like a wounded animal, carrying dust and whispers of a storm to come. Beatrice Dawson gripped the edges of her tattered shawl as she stood at the precipice of Raven's Bluff, the highest cliff overlooking Dillon, Montana. The year was 1878, and she had nothing left to live for, or so she thought, until the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her grief-stricken trance. "Miss, don't you move another inch," called a deep voice, its timbre as rough as the terrain that surrounded them. Beatrice didn't turn around. The tears streaking down her face mingled with the first drops of rain. The hem of her simple blue calico dress fluttered dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. One more step and gravity would claim her, ending the pain that had consumed her since her father's death 3 days prior. "I said don't move." The voice was closer now, urgent and commanding. She heard the thud of boots hitting the ground as the rider dismounted. But still she stared ahead at the vast expanse before her, the valley below, the distant mountains, and the freedom that awaited in the endless sky. "There ain't nothing down there worth finding out about," the man said, his voice softening slightly. "Whatever's troubling you, it can't be worth this." Beatrice closed her eyes. "You don't understand. I have nothing left. My father is gone, our ranch will be seized for debts, and her voice broke. I am alone." The stranger's footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her, careful and measured. "My name is Quentin Yates," he said, "and I reckon you're Beatrice Dawson. Your pa spoke of you often." Her eyes flew open, and she risked a glance over her shoulder. The man stood 6 feet away, his hands outstretched in a placating gesture. He wore a dust-covered duster, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, and a gunbelt slung around his hips. A cowboy, but not one she recognized from the surrounding ranches. "You knew my father?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Worked with him last spring driving cattle up from Texas. Good man, fair and honest." Quentin took another step closer. "He wouldn't want this for you, Miss Dawson." A sob escaped her lips. "What he would have wanted doesn't matter anymore. Nothing matters. That's where you're wrong. He was only a few feet away now. Everything matters. Every breath, every sunrise, every chance to begin again." Beatrice turned fully toward him now, her feet still perilously close to the edge. The movement caused loose rocks to skitter over the cliff's edge, plummeting into the darkness below. The sound of their impact never reached her ears. "There is no beginning again for me," she whispered. "The bank is taking everything tomorrow. I have nowhere to go, no family, no." In that moment, a gust of wind stronger than the others caught her off guard. Beatrice felt her balance falter, her arms windmilling desperately as she began to tip backward over the cliff's edge. Time slowed. She saw Quentin's face transform from concern to horror, saw him lunge forward with a speed that defied explanation. His strong fingers closed around her wrist, and with a powerful yank, he pulled her away from the precipice and into his chest. They fell backward together onto solid ground, his arms wrapped tightly around her trembling form. For several heartbeats, neither moved. The only sounds were their ragged breathing and the increasing patter of raindrops on the dusty earth. "I've got you," Quentin murmured against her hair. "I've got you now." Beatrice's fingers clutched at his shirt, the reality of how close she had come to death washing over her in waves. She wept openly now, all pretense of strength abandoned. "Let it out," he said, his voice gentle as he held her. "Just let it out." The skies opened fully then, rain cascading down upon them. Neither made a move to seek shelter, letting the downpour wash away dirt, tears, and the moment that had nearly ended in tragedy. When Beatrice's sobs finally subsided, Quentin carefully helped her to her feet. "My horse is just over there," he said, gesturing to a chestnut gelding standing patiently nearby. "Let me take you home." I told you, she said, her voice hollow. I have no home after tomorrow. Quentin's eyes, the color of storm clouds, held hers steadily. Then we'll figure something out. Together. He hesitated, then added, I made a promise to your pa before he passed. Her breath caught. You saw him before. He nodded solemnly. I rode into town 3 days ago, found him at Doc Sullivan's. He was fading fast, but he recognized me. Asked me to look after you, said he was worried about the debts and what would happen. His jaw tightened. I gave him my word, Miss Dawson. You're a stranger, she said, though there was less conviction in her voice. Not to your father I wasn't. He guided her toward his horse. And not to you, if you'll give me a chance to prove it. As Quentin helped her mount his horse, Beatrice felt something she hadn't expected to feel again, a flicker of hope. It was small, fragile as a newly lit match in a storm, but it was there. He swung up behind her, his arms forming a protective circle as he took the reins. Hold on, he instructed, and Beatrice leaned back against his solid chest, drawing from his strength. As they rode down from Raven's Bluff toward the Dawson Ranch, Beatrice didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time since her father's passing, she found herself wanting to find out. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle by the time they reached the small ranch house that had been Beatrice's home for all of her 22 years. The modest structure sat nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, its weather-beaten exterior belying the warmth it had once contained. Now it stood as a silent reminder of all she was about to lose. Quentin dismounted first, then reached up to help Beatrice down. His hand spanned her waist, strong and sure as he lifted her from the saddle. For a moment they stood close, her hands resting on his shoulders, their eyes locked in an unspoken understanding. Thank you, she murmured, stepping back, for saving my life. Though I'm not entirely convinced it was worth saving. It was, he said with quiet certainty. And one day you'll agree with me. Beatrice led the way to the porch, her sodden skirts clinging uncomfortably to her legs. She fumbled with the key, her hand still trembling slightly from her ordeal. The door creaked open, revealing the sparse but tidy interior. It's not much, she said, embarrassment coloring her words as she lit a lamp. But it was home. Quentin removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. It's a fine place, he said, his eyes taking in the hand-sewn curtains, the worn but polished furniture, the dried wildflowers arranged in a pottery vase, all touches that spoke of care and pride. Would you like some coffee? Beatrice asked, falling back on the hospitality her mother had ingrained in her before consumption had taken her 5 years earlier. You must be chilled through. That would be welcome, he replied, hanging his duster on a peg by the door. As Beatrice busied herself at the stove, she felt Quentin's eyes following her. You said you knew my father from a cattle drive, she prompted, needing to fill the silence. Were you a drover? Trail boss, actually, he said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. Your pa was hired on as a cook. Best biscuits I ever had on the trail. A ghost of a smile crossed Beatrice's face. He always did have a way with biscuits. He talked about you every night around the campfire, how smart you were, how you kept the books for the ranch. How proud he was that you'd gotten your schooling. Quentin accepted the steaming mug she offered, said you could have been a teacher if you hadn't been needed here. Beatrice sat across from him, her own coffee untouched. He exaggerated. I merely attended the school in Dillon until I was 18. Still more than most women get out here, Quentin observed. He took a sip of his coffee, then set the mug down decisively. Now, about your situation. How much does the bank say your father owed? She blinked, startled by the direct question. $500. The drought last summer killed half our cattle, and then the winter took most of what was left. We've been barely hanging on. Quentin nodded thoughtfully. And the bank's coming tomorrow. Yes. Mr. Hargrove said there was nothing to be done. The papers were all in order. Beatrice's throat tightened. Father tried to get an extension, but Mr. Hargrove refused, said there were already buyers interested in the land. A shadow passed over Quentin's features. Hargrove, eh? Frederick Hargrove. You know him. Know of him, Quentin replied, his voice carefully neutral. He's got something of a reputation in these parts. He drummed his fingers on the table, then looked up with determination. Miss Dawson, I'd like to propose a solution. Beatrice straightened. What kind of solution? I've been looking to settle down, invest in some land. I've got savings from my years on the trail. He met her gaze directly. I could pay off your debt, become a partner in this ranch. Her mouth fell open in shock. You can't be serious. You barely know me. Why would you? I gave your pa my word, he interrupted. And a man's only as good as his word out here. He hesitated, then added more softly, besides, I've been thinking on finding a place to put down roots, getting too old for the trail life. Beatrice studied him. He couldn't be much past 30, with laugh lines just beginning to form at the corners of his eyes, and a few strands of silver threading through the hair at his temples. There was something solid about him, dependable in a way that reminded her of her father. It's a generous offer, Mr. Yates, but I couldn't accept such charity. Not charity, he corrected. An investment. You know this land, how to work it. I've got the capital and the experience with cattle. It could be a profitable partnership. He leaned forward. And it would honor the promise I made to your father. Beatrice rose from the table, moving to the window to stare out at the rain-soaked land that had been in her family for 2 generations. And what would this partnership entail exactly? What would be expected of me? Quentin joined her at the window, keeping a respectful distance. You'd continue managing the books, making the decisions you've always made. I'd handle the cattle operation, maybe bring in some hands to help rebuild the herd. He paused. You'd have your own room, your own space. This would be a business arrangement, Miss Dawson. Nothing more. The sincerity in his voice made her want to believe him, but Beatrice had heard stories of women in desperate situations accepting similar offers, only to find themselves little more than property. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course. He glanced out the window at the darkening sky, though we don't have much of it. What time is the bank coming tomorrow? 9 o'clock. Quentin nodded. Then we have until 9 to decide. He moved toward the door. I'll see to my horse and sleep in the barn if that's all right. Give you some privacy to consider. Beatrice watched him don his hat and duster. Mr. Yates, she called as he opened the door. Why did my father trust you so much, in just one cattle drive? Quentin paused, his hand on the doorknob. There was a stampede. Your pa got caught in it, his leg was broken. I carried him 3 miles to the camp, stayed up all night to make sure gangrene didn't set in. His eyes met hers. A man shows his true character in moments of crisis, Miss Dawson. Your father saw mine, and I saw his. With that, he stepped out into the rain, leaving Beatrice with more questions than answers, but also with something she had lost at the top of Raven's Bluff, a choice. She spent a restless night, torn between pride and pragmatism. By dawn, she had made her decision. Quentin was already in the kitchen when she emerged from her bedroom, his hair damp from washing at the pump outside. He'd started the coffee and was frying bacon in the cast-iron skillet. Hope you don't mind, he said, glancing up as she entered. Thought you might need some sustenance before facing Hargrove. Beatrice smoothed down her best dress, a navy blue affair with modest lace at the collar, and took a seat at the table. I've been thinking about your proposal, she said, accepting the plate he offered. And his expression revealed nothing, but she noticed how still he had become, waiting for her answer. I'll accept, on one condition. She met his gaze steadily. We draw up a formal contract stating clearly that we are business partners with equal say in how the ranch is run. I won't be a silent partner, Mr. Yates. A slow smile spread across his face. I wouldn't expect anything less, and if we're to be partners, I think you should call me Quentin. Quentin, she repeated, trying the name on her tongue. Then you should call me Beatrice. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, the tension of the previous night giving way to a cautious optimism. At 8:30, the sound of an approaching buggy drew them both to the window. "He's early," Beatrice murmured, her stomach tightening with apprehension. Quentin squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "Let me do the talking. Hargrove respects money more than he respects women, sad to say." Frederick Hargrove was a corpulent man with small, calculating eyes and a perpetual sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He seemed momentarily taken aback to find Quentin at Beatrice's side as they met him on the porch. "Miss Dawson," Hargrove said, tipping his hat perfunctorily. "I trust you've packed your personal belongings." His gaze slid to Quentin. "And who might this be?" "Quentin Yates," Quentin replied, extending his hand. His grip must have been firm because Hargrove winced slightly. "Miss Dawson's new business partner." Hargrove's eyebrows shot up. "Partner? I wasn't aware. It's a recent development," Beatrice interjected. "Mr. Yates and I have come to an arrangement that will allow us to settle my father's debt in full." The banker's expression soured. "I see. Well, that's unexpected." He pulled a folder from his briefcase. "The amount due is $500 plus $25 in interest and fees." Quentin's jaw tightened at the additional charges, but he merely nodded. "Of course. If you'll step inside, we can complete the transaction." Once seated at the kitchen table, Quentin produced a leather pouch from his vest pocket. He counted out the full amount in gold coins, the metallic clink seeming unusually loud in the quiet room. $525, he said, pushing the stack toward Hargrove. "I believe that settles the Dawson account." Hargrove's fingers closed around the coins with barely disguised greed. "Yes, well, I'll need to provide a receipt, of course." He scribbled on a piece of paper, then slid it across to them. "And I'll need to file paperwork in town regarding the change in ownership." "Partial ownership," Beatrice corrected firmly. "I retain my share of the ranch. Mr. Yates is purchasing my father's outstanding debt, not his property." Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? And what percentage of ownership are we discussing?" 50-50, Quentin stated, his tone brooking no argument. "Equal partners in all respects." The banker looked between them, clearly disappointed that his plans for the property had been thwarted. "Very well. I'll have the proper documents drawn up." He rose, gathering his briefcase. "You'll need to come into town tomorrow to sign them." After showing Hargrove out, Beatrice and Quentin stood on the porch, watching the buggy disappear down the long drive that connected the ranch to the main road to Dillon. "He didn't seem pleased," Beatrice observed. "No, he didn't," Quentin agreed. "I suspect Hargrove had other plans for this land." He turned to her. "But that's one hurdle cleared. Now we need to discuss how to make this ranch profitable again." Over the next few weeks, a rhythm developed between them. Quentin rose before dawn each day to tend to the few remaining cattle and the work horses. He repaired fences, cleared irrigation ditches, and rode the boundaries of the property, familiarizing himself with every acre of the Dawson ranch. Beatrice maintained the house, kept the books, and worked alongside Quentin whenever an extra pair of hands was needed. They ate their meals together, talking of plans and possibilities for the ranch's future. Quentin spoke of breeding better stock, of finding markets for their beef beyond the local butcher. Beatrice suggested diversifying, perhaps growing hay to sell to other ranchers, or keeping a larger vegetable garden to supply the general store in Dillon. Their conversations were easy, their silences comfortable. Yet Beatrice maintained a careful distance, remembering that theirs was a business arrangement, nothing more. If she sometimes found herself watching Quentin as he worked, admiring the way sunlight caught in his dark hair or the gentle way he handled animals, she attributed it to simple appreciation for a capable partner. One evening in early June, as they sat on the porch after supper watching fireflies rise from the grass, Quentin broached a subject they had been avoiding. "We need more hands," he said. "I can manage the daily work, but if we're going to expand the herd like we've discussed, I'll need help." Beatrice nodded. "I've been reviewing the ledgers. We can afford to hire 2 men, maybe 3 if they're willing to work for room and board plus a small wage. I know some good cowboys from my trail days, men I trust." Quentin rolled a cigarette, his fingers deft with the paper and tobacco. "I can ride into town tomorrow, send some telegrams. That sounds sensible." She watched him light the cigarette, the brief flare illuminating the strong lines of his face. "But where will they stay? The bunkhouse hasn't been used in years." "I noticed." He exhaled a stream of smoke. "It needs work, but the structure's sound. New roof, some patching of the walls, could be habitable in a week or so." Beatrice hesitated, then said what had been on her mind. "And you? Will you move to the bunkhouse as well?" Quentin looked at her, surprise evident in his expression. "I've been comfortable enough in the barn." "That was meant to be temporary," she pointed out. "You're not a hired hand, you're a partner. You should have proper accommodations." He studied her for a moment. "What are you suggesting, Beatrice?" "The house has 3 bedrooms. Mine, my father's, and a small one my mother used for sewing." She kept her tone matter of fact. "My father's room has been empty since." "Well, it makes no sense for you to sleep in the barn when there's a perfectly good bed going unused." Quentin was silent for so long that Beatrice began to wonder if she had overstepped. Then he crushed out his cigarette and said quietly, "People will talk. A single woman and a single man living under the same roof, even with separate bedrooms." "People already talk," she replied with a hint of bitterness. "They've been talking since the day you arrived. Mrs. Peterson at the general store barely looks me in the eye anymore, and Reverend Walsh made a pointed sermon about living in sin last Sunday." "I'm sorry," Quentin said. "That's not fair to you," she shrugged. "Life rarely is, but I won't have my partner sleeping in a barn like a hired hand just to appease the gossips of Dylan." She rose from her chair. "The room is yours if you want it. I'll have fresh linens on the bed by tomorrow evening." Before he could respond, she went inside, leaving Quentin alone with the fireflies and his thoughts. The next morning, Quentin rode into town as planned. Beatrice spent the day cleaning out her father's room, a task she had been avoiding. She packed away his clothes, his pipe, his small collection of books. Each item held memories that threatened to overwhelm her, but she persevered, finding a strange comfort in preparing the space for Quentin. When he returned late in the afternoon, he had news. "Sent telegrams to 3 men I trust. Should hear back within a few days." He hesitated, then added, "Also spoke to Judge Wilson about drawing up a more formal partnership agreement between us, something more binding than what Hargrove put together." Beatrice nodded approvingly. "That's a good idea. When do we meet with him?" "Next Tuesday, if that suits you." Quentin removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "There's something else. I ran into Reverend Walsh in town." Her heart sank. "And," he made his disapproval quite clear. Quentin's jaw tightened. "Suggested that we were setting a poor example for the community." Beatrice felt a flush of anger, as if it's any of his business how we conduct ours. "It isn't," Quentin agreed, "but he did make one point that's worth considering." He met her eyes directly. "Our arrangement, while perfectly innocent to us, could harm your reputation beyond repair." I don't care what people think, she insisted, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. You should. This is your home, these are your neighbors. He took a deep breath. Beatrice, there's another solution that would silence the gossips and protect your good name. She stared at him, realization dawning slowly. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting, marriage? He said simply. A partnership in name as well as deed. Beatrice couldn't have been more shocked if he'd suggested they fly to the moon. Marriage, she repeated incredulously. That's your solution. It's a practical one, he countered. We're already business partners. This would simply formalize our arrangement in the eyes of society. Marriage is more than a business arrangement, Quentin. It can be, he said quietly. But it doesn't have to be. We get along well enough. We respect each other. The rest. He shrugged. The rest can remain as it is. Separate rooms, separate lives, except in the eyes of the law and the town. Beatrice turned away, her mind whirling. The idea was absurd, and yet, wasn't there a certain logic to it? A marriage of convenience was hardly unheard of in the West, where practical considerations often outweighed romantic notions. I need to think, she said finally. Quentin nodded. Of course, it's not a decision to be made lightly. He picked up his saddlebags. I'll take my things to the bunkhouse for now. Seems the simplest solution until you've had time to consider. As he turned to leave, Beatrice called after him. You haven't even asked me properly. He paused, confusion crossing his features. Asked you? If this is to be a marriage proposal, even one of convenience, I believe tradition dictates certain formalities. She lifted her chin, challenging him. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something that might have been amusement. Slowly, deliberately, he set down his saddlebags and crossed to where she stood. Then, to her astonishment, he lowered himself to one knee. Beatrice Dawson, he said, his voice low and serious, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? For the sake of the ranch, for the sake of propriety, and for the sake of the partnership we've begun to build. Looking down at him, this man who had saved her life, who had kept his promise to her father, who had offered her a way to keep her home, Beatrice felt something shift inside her. This wasn't love, she knew that, but it was respect and perhaps the beginning of something that could grow into affection. Yes, she heard herself say, I will marry you, Quentin Yates, for all those reasons. He rose to his feet, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Well then, he said, picking up his saddlebags again, I suppose I'll be moving into that room after all. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small white church in Dillon. Judge Wilson performed the ceremony, as Reverend Walsh had mysteriously developed a prior commitment once he learned of their intention to marry. The witnesses were few. Doc Sullivan, who had tended to Beatrice's father in his final days, Mrs. Rivera, the widowed owner of the town's only restaurant who had always been kind to Beatrice, and 3 dusty cowboys who had arrived at the ranch just days before, answering Quentin's telegrams. Beatrice wore her mother's wedding dress, a simple ivory gown that Mrs. Rivera had helped her alter to fit her taller frame. Quentin wore a new black suit that made him look both distinguished and slightly uncomfortable, tugging at the collar as if it were too tight. The ceremony was brief, the words traditional. When Judge Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin leaned down to place a chaste kiss on Beatrice's lips there first. His mouth was warm and surprisingly soft, the contact brief but enough to send an unexpected flutter through her stomach. Afterward, they hosted a small reception at the ranch. Mrs. Rivera had prepared a feast of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. The newly hired hands Tom Fletcher, Illy Cooper, and a young half-Mexican cowboy everyone called Shorty, despite his 6-foot height, seemed to enjoy themselves. though they were clearly bemused by the unusual circumstances of their employment. "Never been hired by a bride before," Tom commented good-naturedly as he helped himself to a second serving of pie. "But I reckon it's a good omen. A ranch with a woman's touch tends to run smoother." As the celebration wound down and their guests departed, Beatrice found herself alone with Quentin on the porch, just as they had been on so many evenings. Only now, the gold band on her finger caught the last rays of sunlight, a tangible reminder of how much had changed. "Well, Mrs. Yates," Quentin said, the name still strange to both their ears, "I believe we've successfully silenced the gossips." "And created a whole new set of expectations," she replied, twisting the ring on her finger. He seemed to understand her unspoken concern. "Nothing has to change between us, Beatrice. The arrangement we discussed still stands." She nodded, grateful for his reassurance yet strangely uncertain about her own feelings. The kiss during the ceremony, brief though it was, had awakened something she hadn't expected, a curiosity about what it might be like to be truly married to this man. "It's been a long day," she said finally. "I think I'll turn in." Quentin tipped his head in acknowledgement. "Good night, then." As she lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Quentin moving about in the room across the hall, Beatrice wondered if she had made a terrible mistake or taken the first step toward a future she couldn't yet imagine. Summer blended into fall, and the rhythm of ranch life dictated their days. The marriage certificate hung framed in the parlor, a public declaration of their union, while privately they maintained their separate spaces and careful boundaries. Yet something was shifting between them, subtle as the changing seasons. Quentin, true to his word, treated Beatrice with unfailing respect. He consulted her on all decisions regarding the ranch, deferred to her knowledge of the land and its seasons, and never presumed upon their marital status. The hands, following his lead, showed her the same deference they would any rancher's wife, perhaps more, given her active role in managing the operation. Under their joint stewardship, the ranch began to prosper. They purchased new breeding stock, improved irrigation for the hay fields, and secured contracts with merchants not just in Dillon but in Virginia City, and even as far as Helena. The ledgers, once filled with red ink, gradually showed a modest but growing profit. With prosperity came changes to the ranch itself. The bunkhouse was fully restored, a new barn raised with the help of neighboring ranchers, and the main house received much-needed repairs. Beatrice planted a garden that yielded abundantly, and Mrs. Rivera taught her to preserve the harvest for winter use. If the townspeople of Dillon had initially viewed their marriage with suspicion, most had come around to cautious approval by the time autumn painted the cottonwoods gold. The Yates Ranch, as it was now known, provided employment and purchased supplies locally. Quentin and Beatrice attended church regularly, Reverend Walsh having reconciled himself to their union, contributed to community functions, and generally conducted themselves as model citizens. Only Beatrice knew the growing restlessness that plagued her in the quiet moments. Only she recognized the way her eyes sought Quentin across a room, how she found excuses to work alongside him, how his rare smiles and rarer laughter affected her. The evening of their 6-month anniversary, not that either acknowledged the date, found them in the kitchen after supper. Beatrice was preserving the last of the apples from their small orchard, while Quentin sat at the table cleaning his revolver, a ritual he performed every Saturday night. "Tom says the north pasture should be ready for the cattle by spring," Quentin remarked, carefully oiling the cylinder. "That new grass seed took well." "That's good news," Beatrice replied, stirring the pot of simmering apples. The soil analyst from Helena, Said it would be more drought-resistant than what we had before. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of Quentin's cleaning cloth and the bubbling of the apple preserves. It was peaceful, domestic in a way that made Beatrice's heart ache with conflicted emotions. "You've been quiet lately," Quentin observed, reassembling his weapon with practiced ease. "Is everything all right?" Beatrice kept her eyes on her task. "Everything's fine. Just busy with the harvest and preserving." He made a non-committal sound that suggested he didn't entirely believe her. Shorty mentioned that Frederick Hargrove was asking questions about the ranch when he was in town yesterday. This caught her attention. "What kind of questions?" "About our cattle count, our contracts, whether we were planning to expand." Quentin holstered his cleaned revolver. Shorty thought it odd enough to mention. Beatrice frowned. "Hargrove has never shown interest in ranching before. His concerns are banking and land speculation." "Exactly." Quentin rose, moving to stand beside her at the stove. "I think he's still nursing a grudge about how things worked out with this place. Might be looking for weaknesses." "Well, he won't find any," Beatrice said firmly, though the news disturbed her. "We're more solvent now than this ranch has been in years." "True enough." Quentin watched her pour the apple preserves into waiting jars. "Here, let me help with those." He reached for a jar just as she did, their hands brushing. The contact was brief but electric. Beatrice nearly dropped the jar, saved only by Quentin's quick reflexes as he caught it, his hand closing over hers in the process. "Careful," he murmured. "It's hot." She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the clean soap and leather scent of him, of the warmth of his hand over hers. "I thank you," she stammered, withdrawing her hand as soon as he took the jar. Quentin's eyes held hers for a long moment, something unreadable in their depths. Then he stepped back, allowing her space. "I think I'll check on the horses before turning in," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Beatrice nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched him don his hat and coat, listened to his footsteps cross the porch and fade into the night. Only when she was certain he was gone did she allow herself to sink into a kitchen chair, her heart racing as if she'd run a mile. This couldn't continue. The careful balance they had established was beginning to falter, at least on her side. Somewhere along the way, her feelings for Quentin had evolved from cautious gratitude to genuine respect, to something dangerously close to affection, perhaps even desire. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. Their marriage was one of convenience, a business arrangement with social benefits. Quentin had never indicated he wanted anything more. To allow these growing feelings free rein would only lead to heartache and awkwardness that could jeopardize everything they had built together. Resolved to master her emotions, Beatrice finished her canning and prepared for bed. But sleep proved elusive as she listened to Quentin's return, his familiar footsteps pausing outside her door before continuing to his own room. The first snow of winter came early that year, blanketing the ranch in pristine white just days after Thanksgiving. Beatrice stood at the kitchen window, watching fat flakes drift lazily from a pearl-gray sky when Quentin burst through the door in a flurry of cold air and urgency. "Storm's coming," he announced, stamping snow from his boots. "A bad one, according to Shorty. He's got a knack for weather." Beatrice turned from the window. "How bad?" "Blizzard. Probably hit by nightfall." Quentin hung his coat on the peg by the door. "I've sent Tom and Ellie to bring the cattle down from the high pasture. Shorty's securing the barn and outbuildings." She nodded, mentally cataloging preparations. "I'll inventory our supplies, make sure we have enough to last if we're snowed in." "Good thinking." He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them. "I need to check the firewood situation. We've been stockpiling, but with a real Montana blizzard." "There's coffee on the stove," Beatrice offered. "Get warm before you go back out." Gratitude flickered in his eyes. "Thanks." He poured himself a cup, cradling it between his palms. "This will be your first winter here since before Father died," she completed. "Yes. But not my first Montana winter." She attempted a smile. "I know what to expect." What neither of them expected was the ferocity of the storm that descended upon the ranch that evening. The wind howled like a wounded beast, driving snow horizontally against the windows with such force it seemed the glass might shatter. The temperature plummeted, and despite the roaring fires Quentin maintained in both the parlor and kitchen fireplaces, the house grew steadily colder. Tom, Illy, and Shorty had made it back with the cattle just before the worst hit, and were now hunkered down in the bunkhouse. With supplies, Beatrice had sent over coffee, beans, bacon, and a loaf of fresh bread. The animals were secure in the barn and lower pastures, with extra hay distributed before the storm made feeding impossible. Beatrice paced the kitchen, checking the windows for any sign of the storm abating. Quentin entered from the parlor, his arms laden with firewood. "Any change?" he asked, depositing the logs beside the stove. She shook her head. "If anything, it's worse. I can barely see the barn lantern anymore." Quentin frowned. "The temperature's dropping fast. I'm concerned about the pipes freezing." "What can we do?" "Keep water running at a trickle in the kitchen and washroom," he said. "And I think we should consider closing off the unused rooms to conserve heat." As the evening progressed, it became clear that even these measures might not be sufficient. The wind found every crack and crevice in the old house, sending drafts of frigid air slithering across the floors. By 10 o'clock, when they would normally have retired to their separate rooms, the upstairs hallway was cold enough to see their breath. "This is untenable," Quentin declared, returning from checking the upstairs. "Your room is the warmest, being above the kitchen, but even there the temperature's dangerously low." Beatrice hugged herself, shivering despite the shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "What do you suggest?" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to propose. "I think we should both sleep down here in the parlor by the fire. We can drag mattresses down, pile on all the blankets we have." It was the sensible solution, but Beatrice felt a flutter of nerves at the thought of such proximity. Still, pride and propriety seemed foolish concerns when weighed against the very real danger of the cold. "You're right," she said with as much composure as she could muster. "I'll get extra blankets from the linen chest." Together, they transformed the parlor into a makeshift sleeping area. Quentin dragged his mattress downstairs and positioned it near the fireplace, then helped Beatrice arrange blankets and quilts into a thick pallet. They worked in silence, the howling wind and crackling fire the only sounds in the room. When all was prepared, an awkward moment ensued as they stood looking at the separate beds they had created, mere feet apart. "I'll keep the fire going through the night," Quentin offered, breaking the tension. "You should get some rest." Beatrice nodded, retreating behind the Chinese screen they had set up to give her privacy for changing into her night clothes. She donned her warmest nightgown, then added a flannel robe over it. Her hair, usually braided for sleep, she left loose around her shoulders for extra warmth. When she emerged, Quentin had banked the fire and was sitting on his mattress, still fully dressed except for his boots. He looked up as she approached her pallet, his expression carefully neutral despite the domestic intimacy of the situation. "Comfortable enough?" he asked as she settled under the mountain of quilts. "Yes, thank you." She turned on her side, facing away from him toward the fire. "Good night, Quentin." "Good night, Beatrice," he replied softly. Despite her exhaustion from the day's preparations, sleep eluded Beatrice. She was acutely aware of Quentin's presence just feet away, of his breathing, of the occasional creak as he rose to tend the fire. The storm continued its assault outside, rattling windows and moaning down the chimney. After what felt like hours, Beatrice found herself shivering despite the blankets. The side of her body facing away from the fire had grown cold, and no amount of repositioning seemed to help. "Beatrice." Quentin's voice came through the darkness. "Are you awake?" She turned toward him. "Yes, you're shivering," he observed. "I can hear your teeth chattering." "I'm fine," she insisted, but another violent shiver betrayed her words. Quentin sat up, concern evident even in the dim firelight. "You're not fine, you're freezing." He hesitated, then said what they both knew was necessary. "We should share the blankets. Body heat is the most effective way to stay warm in these conditions." The suggestion hung in the air between them, fraught with implications that went far beyond the practical matter of survival. "Quentin, it's just survival, Beatrice," he said quietly. "Nothing more." She knew he was right. With a nod, she watched as he pushed his mattress next to hers, creating a larger sleeping area. Then, with movements that betrayed his own nervousness, he slid under the combined pile of blankets, maintaining a careful distance between them. "Better already," he said, his voice deliberately light. Like having a stove on both sides. Despite her anxiety, Beatrice found herself smiling at his attempt to ease the tension. "The fire is hardly my equal in heat production." "No," he agreed, "it's much less stubborn." A surprised laugh escaped her. "Are you calling me stubborn, Quentin Yates?" "Determined," he amended. "Strong-willed. Resolute." "All very diplomatic alternatives," she observed, relaxing slightly as the shared warmth beneath the blankets began to penetrate her chilled limbs. They fell into silence, but it was more comfortable now. Beatrice found her eyelids growing heavy as warmth returned to her body. Just before sleep claimed her, she murmured, "Thank you for saving me. Not just on the cliff, but every day since." If Quentin replied, she didn't hear it, already drifting into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. Beatrice awoke to pale light filtering through frosted windows and the solid presence of a warm body pressed against her back. For a moment, disoriented from sleep, she tensed. Then memory returned: the blizzard, the cold, the practical decision to share warmth. Quentin's arm was draped over her waist, his breathing deep and even against her hair. They had gravitated toward each other in sleep, seeking heat unconsciously. The realization should have alarmed her, sent her scrambling away to restore proper distance. Instead, Beatrice found herself reluctant to move, to break this unexpected moment of genuine intimacy. She allowed herself the luxury of remaining still, savoring the security she felt in his embrace. This was what a real marriage might feel like. She thought: this quiet trust, this unspoken protection. The fire had burned low overnight, and the room beyond their cocoon of blankets was decidedly chilly. Outside, the storm seemed to have abated somewhat, though snow still fell steadily past the windows. They would need to check on the animals soon, assess any damage, ensure the hands in the bunkhouse were safe. But for now, for just a few more minutes, Beatrice permitted herself this small indulgence. Behind her, Quentin stirred. She felt the exact moment he became fully awake, felt the subtle tensing of his body as he realized their position. His arm remained where it was for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he carefully withdrew it. "Morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. Storms let up some. Beatrice turned to face him, maintaining a modest distance between them now that they were both awake. "Yes, though it's still snowing." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, acknowledgement of the line they had approached in the night, even if neither had consciously crossed it. Quentin's hair was tousled from sleep, his jaw shadowed with stubble, and Beatrice was struck by how different he looked in this unguarded moment, younger, somehow, and more vulnerable. "I should check on the stock," he said, though he made no immediate move to rise. "And I should start breakfast," she replied, equally stationary. They continued to regard each other, the air between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Then, with careful deliberation, Quentin reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Beatrice," he began, his voice pitched low. A sharp knock at the door interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They both started, the spell broken. "Boss," Shorty's voice called from the porch. "You folks all right in there?" Quentin closed his eyes briefly as if gathering himself, then called back, "We're fine, Shorty. Be right there." To Beatrice, he said softly, "To be continued," before rising from their shared bed. As Beatrice watched him pull on his boots and move to answer the door, she wondered what he had been about to say, and whether the interruption had been providence or misfortune. The blizzard left 4 feet of snow across the ranch, with drifts twice that height against buildings and fences. For 3 days, they were effectively isolated, able only to travel between the main house, the barn, and the bunkhouse via pathways they laboriously shoveled through the snow. During this time, a subtle shift occurred in Quentin and Beatrice's relationship. The night spent sharing warmth had broken down some invisible barrier between them. They worked together more seamlessly than ever, anticipating each other's needs, communicating with glances and brief touches that would have been unthinkable before. Neither mentioned what had almost transpired that morning, yet both seemed acutely aware of the unfinished conversation that hung between them. Each evening, they retreated to their separate rooms, the practical necessity of shared sleeping arrangements having passed with the worst of the cold. But Beatrice found herself lying awake, remembering the security of Quentin's arm around her waist, the solid warmth of his presence at her back. On the 4th day after the storm, the sun emerged brilliantly in a cloudless sky. The temperature remained well below freezing, but the improved visibility meant they could finally assess the full impact of the blizzard on their operation. "We lost 3 head that we know of," Quentin reported as he returned from riding the boundaries with Tom. He stamped snow from his boots at the kitchen door, his face ruddy from cold. "Could have been much worse. The cattle from the high pasture all made it through." Beatrice handed him a mug of coffee. "What about the fences?" "Some damage along the north line, but nothing we can't repair once some of this snow melts." He sipped the coffee gratefully. "The real problem is the road to town. It's completely impassable." "How long until it clears?" he shrugged. "Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on whether we get more snow before a proper thaw." Being cut off from town presented certain challenges, but they were well supplied and self-sufficient. What concerned Beatrice more was a piece of news that had reached them just before the storm. Frederick Hargrove had purchased the neighboring Phillips Ranch and installed his nephew as manager. "I don't like it," Quentin had said when they first heard. "Hargrove has no interest in ranching. He's planning something." Now, watching him warm himself by the kitchen stove, Beatrice broached the subject again. "Do you think Hargrove will use the storm as an opportunity?" "While we're isolated," Quentin's expression darkened. "It's possible. That's why I've asked the men to keep watch in shifts, day and night." He set down his coffee mug with deliberate care. "There's something else you should know. When I was in town last week, I heard rumors that Hargrove's been buying up water rights all along the Beaverhead River." The implications were immediately clear to Beatrice. Their ranch depended on water access from the river for both cattle and crops, if Hargrove controlled those rights. "Can he do that?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Legally, yes. Ethically, no," Quentin's jaw tightened. He's using proxies, shell companies. Most folks don't even realize what's happening until it's too late. And our water rights, secure for now. Your father was smart enough to file proper claims years ago. He paused. But Hargrove's a patient man. He'll keep looking for weaknesses, keep pressuring from all sides. Beatrice felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter weather. What do? We stay vigilant, and we consider making some strategic moves of our own. Quentin held her gaze. There's land coming up for auction next month, the old Carson place. It borders both our property and the river, if we acquired it. We'd strengthen our position, Beatrice finished. But can we afford it? It would stretch us thin, he admitted. We'd have to take out a small loan. From Hargrove's bank? She raised an eyebrow skeptically. No. I've been corresponding with a bank in Helena that's looking to expand its agricultural portfolio. They're interested in working with successful operations like ours. He pulled an envelope from his vest pocket. This came just before the storm. They've conditionally approved us for the amount we'd need. Beatrice took the letter, scanning its contents. This is unexpected good news. It's an opportunity, Quentin agreed, but not without risk. We'd be leveraged for a year or two, until we could increase the herd enough to cover the additional cost. This was exactly the kind of decision they had always made together, weighing options, considering consequences. Yet as Beatrice looked at Quentin now, she realized how much their partnership had evolved. The man who had pulled her back from the edge of Raven's Bluff had become not just her business partner, not just her husband in name, but someone she trusted implicitly with her future. I think we should do it, she said finally. Hargrove won't stop until he controls everything in this valley. We need to protect what's ours. Quentin's smile was slow but genuine. I was hoping you'd say that. Were you now? She returned his smile. Getting predictable, am I? Not predictable, he corrected. Consistent in your courage. The compliment warmed her more than the stove ever could. Well then, we have a plan. We do, Quentin agreed. Then more hesitantly he added, about what I was going to say that morning before Shorty interrupted. A crash from the barn cut him off, followed by shouting. They both froze, listening intently. Fire, came Ellie's distant cry. Fire in the barn. They were moving before the echo faded, grabbing coats, Quentin seizing the rifle from above the door as they burst onto the porch. Through the crystal-clear winter air, they could see smoke beginning to rise from the barn's far end, the hay storage. Get buckets and the men. Quentin shouted to Beatrice as he sprinted toward the barn. And my sidearm from the bedroom. Beatrice raced to obey, her heart pounding. Fire was every rancher's nightmare, especially in winter with animals confined to barns and no ready water source if the well pump froze. She grabbed Quentin's revolver from his bedside table, shouted for the hands who were already emerging from the bunkhouse, and directed them to form a bucket line from the kitchen pump to the barn. By the time she reached the scene, Quentin and Shorty were leading panicked horses from the burning structure while Tom and Ellie frantically shoveled snow onto the flames. The fire had caught quickly in the dry hay, and smoke billowed from the barn doors in ominous black clouds. Here, she called, tossing Quentin his revolver as she joined the bucket line. He caught it one-handed, holstering it as he dove back into the smoke for more animals. For 20 desperate minutes, they battled the blaze, passing buckets of water and throwing snow, trying to contain the fire before it consumed the entire barn. The horses were safe, wild-eyed but uninjured in the corral, but the structure itself was in grave danger. It was Shorty who spotted them first, two figures on horseback, observing from the ridge beyond the north pasture. "Boss," he called to Quentin, pointing. "We got company." Quentin paused in his firefighting, shielding his eyes to look where Shorty indicated. His expression hardened. "Keep at it," he ordered, then turned to Beatrice. "Stay here. Keep the men working." "Where are you going?" she demanded, grabbing his arm, "to have a word with our visitors." His voice was dangerously calm. "I think we've found our arsonists." "You can't be sure of that," she objected. "And you can't confront them alone." "I'm not looking for a confrontation, just confirmation." He touched her cheek briefly. "Trust me." Before she could protest further, he was striding toward the corral, swinging up onto the first saddled horse he found, a nervous bay gelding that belonged to Illy. With a final nod to Beatrice, he spurred the horse toward the distant ridge. She watched him go, torn between continuing the firefight and following him. In the end, duty won out. She turned back to the barn, calling orders and organizing the men's efforts with a clear head despite her churning emotions. They had the fire under control by the time Quentin returned, his expression grim, his horse lathered despite the cold. "It was Hargrove's men, all right," he reported, dismounting beside her. "Recognized one of them from town, works for that nephew who's managing the Phillips place." His voice dripped contempt. "They denied everything, of course, but their tracks tell the story." They circled around from the riverside, where the snow's thinner. Beatrice surveyed the smoldering barn, its eastern wall and roof partially collapsed, the rest standing but smoke damaged. "Why would they do this? What does Hargrove gain from burning our barn?" "It's a message," Quentin said darkly. "A demonstration of what he can do while we're isolated. And it's a financial blow. Rebuilding will cost money we were planning to use for the Carson Place auction." She recognized the calculation behind such a move. "So we're forced to choose: rebuild the barn or expand our holdings." "Exactly." Quentin's hand moved unconsciously to the revolver at his hip. "Hargrove's smarter than I gave him credit for." That evening, after tending to the livestock now housed in hastily arranged temporary shelters, Quentin and Beatrice sat at the kitchen table with ledgers spread before them, calculating costs and possibilities. "We can salvage some of the lumber," Quentin pointed out. "And with the men's help we can keep construction costs down." Beatrice nodded, making notations. "If we're careful with supplies, use what we have on hand." She looked up at him. "We can do both. Rebuild and buy the Carson place. It will be tight, but possible." Quentin studied her across the table, admiration clear in his eyes. "You never cease to amaze me, Beatrice Yates." The use of her married name, so rare from his lips, sent an unexpected thrill through her. "It's simple arithmetic," she demurred. "It's courage," he countered. "Anyone else would retreat, play it safe, but not you." She met his gaze steadily. "Not us," she corrected. "This is our ranch, our future. I won't let Hargrove take that from us." Something shifted in Quentin's expression, a softening around his eyes. "No," he agreed quietly, "neither will I." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Then Quentin cleared his throat and returned his attention to the ledgers. "We should get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be a long day of salvage work." Beatrice nodded, gathering the papers into neat stacks. As they prepared for bed, moving around each other with the familiarity of long practice, she found herself wondering again about what he had been about to say that morning after the blizzard, and whether he would ever find the right moment to say it. Spring came early that year, as if in apology for winter's harshness. The snow melted rapidly under March sunshine, transforming the landscape from pristine white to muddy brown to tentative green in the space of weeks. With the thaw came renewed activity on the ranch as they juggled regular seasonal work with barn reconstruction and preparations for the Carson Place auction. True to their plan, they had managed both challenges. The new barn rose steadily, its frame already complete and half the roof in place. Meanwhile, Their bid for the Carson property was prepared, the loan from the Helena Bank secured. The auction was scheduled for the first week of April, just days away. Hargrove had not been idle during this time. Reports from town indicated he was actively courting other potential bidders, trying to drive up the price beyond what Quentin and Beatrice could afford. More disturbing were rumors that he had attempted to have the auction postponed, claiming irregularities in the estate proceedings. "He's getting desperate," Quentin observed as he and Beatrice rode fence lines on a mild afternoon in late March. "That's good for us, but it also makes him dangerous." Beatrice nodded, adjusting her hat against the spring sunshine. "Do you think he'll try something at the auction?" "Possibly. But it would be risky in such a public setting." Quentin reined his horse closer to hers as they navigated a muddy stretch. "I'm more concerned about what he might do if we succeed." They had not experienced any further sabotage since the barn fire, but neither had they let down their guard. The hands took turns standing watch at night, and no one rode the property alone. It was a wearing way to live, this constant vigilance, but necessary. As they crested a rise overlooking the river, Quentin suddenly drew his horse to a halt. "Look there," he said, pointing toward the water's edge on the far bank. Philip's land now owned by Hargrove. Beatrice shaded her eyes, trying to make out what had caught his attention. Then she saw it a work crew with shovels and pickaxes, digging into the riverbank. "What are they doing?" she asked. Quentin's expression was grim. "Preparing to divert the water flow, I'd wager. Creating a new channel that would bypass our water access points. Can they do that legally? Not without permits and approval from every landowner downstream." His jaw tightened. "But by the time anyone could stop them legally, the damage would be done." Beatrice studied the distant workers. "We need to document this. Get witnesses, maybe the sheriff." "Agreed." Quentin turned his horse. "Let's head back. I'll send Shorty into town with a message for Sheriff Miller." They rode in tense silence for several minutes before Beatrice spoke again. "Quentin, if we acquire the Carson place, will that be enough? Or will Hargrove simply find another way to come at us?" He considered her question carefully. "It won't be enough to stop him entirely. But it will secure our water rights more firmly and make his position weaker." He glanced at her. "Men like Hargrove don't stop until they're forced to. Or until they find an easier target," she suggested. "Or that," he agreed. They had reached the ranch yard, where Tom and Ellie were working on the barn roof. Quentin dismounted, then moved to help Beatrice down. His hands spanned her waist, and he lowered her carefully to the ground but didn't immediately release her. "Beatrice," he said, his voice pitched low for her ears only. "Whatever happens with Hargrove, with the auction, with any of it, I want you to know something." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "That day on Raven's Bluff, when I pulled you back from the edge, it saved me as much as it saved you." She looked up at him, startled by the confession. "What do you mean?" His hands remained at her waist, warm and steady. "I was drifting before then. No purpose beyond the next job, the next paycheck. Your father's request gave me direction, but you," he swallowed visibly. "You gave me a home, Beatrice. A reason to plant roots." The naked emotion in his eyes took her breath away. This wasn't gratitude between business partners or even the affection of friends. This was something deeper, something that resonated with the feelings she had been harboring in her own heart. "Quentin," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Boss." Shorty's call interrupted them, just as it had that morning after the blizzard. "Rider coming in." Quentin reluctantly released her, turning toward the approaching horseman. Beatrice recognized the visitor immediately, Judge Wilson's clerk, a young man named Michael Porter. "Mr. Yates, Mrs. Yates," Porter called as he drew closer. "Judge Wilson sent me with urgent news." Quentin moved to intercept the rider. "What news, Porter?" The clerk dismounted, looking somewhat abashed. "I'm afraid the Carson property auction has been postponed. Judge Wilson received new evidence regarding the estate that requires investigation." Beatrice exchanged a glance with Quentin. "What kind of evidence?" she asked. Porter shrugged. "I wasn't privy to the details, madam. But the judge wanted you to know right away, given your interest in the property." "Let me guess," Quentin said dryly. "This evidence was presented by Frederick Hargrove or someone acting on his behalf." The clerk's uncomfortable expression confirmed the suspicion without words. "The judge said to tell you he's aware of certain patterns, but he must follow proper legal procedures." "Of course," Beatrice said diplomatically. "Please thank Judge Wilson for sending word so promptly." After Porter departed, Quentin paced the yard in evident frustration. This is exactly what Hargrove wanted: delay tactics while he continues his other efforts against us. "But not a complete victory," Beatrice pointed out. "Judge Wilson is clearly suspicious of the timing." "True," Quentin conceded. "But it buys Hargrove time, which is all he needs to cause more damage." Later that evening, after supper had been cleared and the hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Beatrice found Quentin on the porch, smoking and staring out at the darkened landscape. She joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. "You're brooding," she observed, settling into the chair beside him. He exhaled a stream of smoke. "Contemplating," he corrected with the ghost of a smile. "There's a difference." "And what conclusions have your contemplations yielded?" Quentin tapped ash from his cigarette. "That we need to change our approach. We've been reactive, responding to Hargrove's moves. We need to take the initiative." Beatrice considered this. "What do you have in mind?" "I'm not entirely sure yet." He turned to look at her, the faint light from the window illuminating half his face. "But I know it starts with being honest with ourselves and each other." Her heart quickened. "What do you mean?" Quentin extinguished his cigarette deliberately, then reached for her hand. "Beatrice, I've been trying to tell you something for months now, but the moment never seems right. There's always some crisis, some interruption." "Tell me now," she said softly. "No interruptions." He took a deep breath. "Our marriage began as an arrangement, a practical solution to practical problems. But somewhere along the way, at least for me, it became something else entirely." His fingers tightened around hers. "I love you, Beatrice. Not as a business partner or a friend, but as a man loves a woman he can't imagine living without." The words hung in the night air between them, momentous and transformative. Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sadness but of overwhelming relief. "Oh, Quentin," she whispered. "I've been such a coward." Concern flickered across his face. "What do you mean?" "I've been feeling the same way for so long, but I was afraid to say it, afraid you didn't want that kind of marriage." She reached up to touch his face. "I love you too, so much that it frightens me sometimes." The wonder in his eyes was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Quentin leaned forward and kissed her. Unlike the brief, chaste contact of their wedding day, this was a real kiss, tender at first, then deepening with months of unspoken longing. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "Well," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "that certainly changes things." Beatrice laughed softly. "Yes, it does." She traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "Quentin, I don't want to sleep in separate rooms anymore." His eyes darkened. "Are you sure? I meant what I said before. I won't rush you into anything you're not ready for." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "We've wasted enough time pretending this is just a business arrangement. I want a real marriage in every sense." The smile that spread across his face was like nothing she had seen before, unguarded, almost boyish in its delight. "Mrs. Yates," he said, rising and drawing her to her feet. "I believe that's the best proposition I've ever received." Hand in hand, they entered the house, closing the door on the outside world and all its concerns. Tonight, at least, Frederick Hargrove and his schemes could wait. Tonight belonged to them alone. The transformation of their marriage from partnership to true union brought a new depth to their relationship, strengthening them for the challenges that lay ahead. The postponed auction, the threatened water rights, Hargrove's persistent machinations, all these remained pressing concerns, but now they faced them together in the fullest sense. April bloomed across the valley, painting the landscape with wildflowers and fresh grass. Cattle that had grown thin during winter began to fill out again on spring pasture. The new barn was completed just in time for the arrival of the first calves, their wobbly legs and curious eyes a promise of the ranch's future. Word came from Judge Wilson that the Carson Place auction had been rescheduled for mid-May, the mysterious evidence having proven insubstantial upon investigation. This news, while welcome, merely heightened the sense that they were approaching a confrontation with Hargrove that could no longer be avoided. That confrontation came sooner than expected, on a clear morning when Beatrice was alone at the house, Quentin and the hands having ridden out at dawn to move cattle to the upper pastures. She was in the garden, planting the season's vegetables, when hoofbeats announced visitors. Looking up, she froze at the sight of Frederick Hargrove himself, accompanied by two men she recognized as employees from his bank. "Mrs. Yates," Hargrove called, his voice oily with false courtesy as he dismounted. "What a pleasant surprise to find you at home." Beatrice straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "Mr. Hargrove, this is unexpected. Is your husband about?" Hargrove glanced around the yard with calculated casualness. "He's out with the herd," she replied, deliberately vague about Quentin's location. "What brings you to our ranch, Mr. Hargrove?" The banker approached, his companions flanking him like bodyguards. "Business, my dear Mrs. Yates, always business." He produced an envelope from his coat pocket. "I've come with a proposition I believe you'll find most interesting." Beatrice eyed the envelope warily. "What kind of proposition?" "A purchase offer." Hargrove extended the envelope. "For the entirety of the Yates ranch, a most generous sum, I assure you." She made no move to take it. "Our ranch is not for sale, Mr. Hargrove." His smile thinned. "Everyone has a price, Mrs. Yates, even you and your cowboy husband." He set the envelope on the garden wall beside her. "Look at the figure before you refuse. It's considerably more than this operation is worth by conventional valuation." "And yet less than its true value, I'm certain," she countered, "particularly when one considers the water rights." A flash of irritation crossed Hargrove's face before his mask of civility reasserted itself. "Ah, you've noticed our improvements on the Phillips property." "Merely agricultural enhancements, I assure you. Enhancements that would coincidentally divert water from our access points." Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "The water commissioner might have a different perspective on such improvements." Hargrove's expression hardened. "The water commissioner is a reasonable man who understands progress, as is Judge Wilson, despite his temporary caution regarding the Carson auction." He stepped closer, his bulk imposing. "Mrs. Yates, I admire your spirit, truly I do, but you must understand that you cannot win this contest. I have resources you cannot match, influence you cannot counter." Beatrice stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "And yet here you are, offering to buy what you claim we cannot keep. Curious, isn't it?" For a moment, raw anger flashed in Hargrove's small eyes. Then he laughed, the sound utterly devoid of humor. "You're a formidable woman, Mrs. Yates, perhaps too clever for your own good." He gestured to the envelope. My offer stands for 48 hours after that. He shrugged expressively. Well, the price of doing business in this valley may increase in ways you find unpleasant. Is that a threat, Mr. Hargrove? She asked calmly, though her heart raced. Merely an economic reality. He tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Good day, Mrs. Yates. Do give my regards to your husband. As Hargrove and his men rode away, Beatrice picked up the envelope, tempted to tear it to pieces unread. Instead, she tucked it into her apron pocket. Quentin would want to see exactly what they were dealing with. She resumed her gardening, but her mind was far from the task at hand. Hargrove's visit confirmed what they had suspected. He was growing desperate, willing to show his hand more openly. That made him dangerous, but it also revealed weakness. A man secure in his position didn't make house calls to deliver threats thinly disguised as offers. When Quentin returned mid-afternoon, she met him at the corral, the envelope in hand. One look at her face told him something had happened. "What is it?" he asked, swinging down from his horse. Wordlessly, she passed him the envelope. He opened it, scanned the document inside, then let out a low whistle. "That's a considerable sum." "But not enough," she said firmly. "No," he agreed, folding the paper and returning it to the envelope. "Not nearly enough for what he's really after." He studied her face. "Are you all right?" "Did he threaten you?" "Not explicitly." She recounted the conversation, watching Quentin's expression darken as she described Hargrove's veiled warnings. "I don't like that he came here while I was gone," Quentin said, his hand unconsciously moving to his sidearm. "From now on, you don't stay here alone." Normally, Beatrice might have bristled at such protectiveness, but the cold calculation in Hargrove's eyes had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. "I think that's wise," she conceded, "at least until this is resolved." They discussed the situation with the hands over supper, all of them agreeing that increased vigilance was necessary. Shorty volunteered to ride into town the next day to inform Sheriff Miller of Hargrove's visit and apparent threats. That night, lying in what was now their shared bedroom, Beatrice voiced the question that had been nagging at her since Hargrove's visit. "What if we can't win, Quentin? What if he really does have too many resources, too much influence?" Quentin gathered her closer in his arms. "Then we adapt. We've survived worse, both of us." "But the ranch is just land," he finished gently. "Important, yes. Worth fighting for, absolutely, but not worth your safety or peace of mind." He kissed her forehead. "If it comes to it, we can start fresh elsewhere. Montana's a big territory." She knew he meant what he said, knew he would walk away from everything they had built if it meant protecting her. The realization both warmed her heart and strengthened her resolve. "We're not giving up," she said firmly. "Not our home, not our future." "No," he agreed, "we're not." "But it helps to remember what really matters." His hand found hers in the darkness, fingers intertwining. "And what really matters to me is right here." The 48 hours of Hargrove's deadline came and went with no response from the Yates ranch. On the morning of the third day, they received word that the diversion work on the Phillips property had suddenly ceased, a small victory, though likely temporary. "He's regrouping," Quentin surmised as they reviewed the latest report from Shorty, who had ridden by the Phillips land on his return from town. "Probably waiting to see what happens with the Carson auction." The auction was now just 2 weeks away. Judge Wilson had assured them through his clerk that no further delays would be permitted, barring extraordinary circumstances. Their loan from the Helena Bank remained secure, the funds ready for transfer upon successful bidding. It was Illy who first noticed the dust cloud on the horizon, the telltale sign of riders approaching at speed. "Company coming, boss," he called from his position on the newly shingled barn roof. "Looks like 4, maybe 5 horses." Quentin and Beatrice exchanged glances. "Get inside," he told her. "Take the shotgun from above the door. Don't come out until I call you." For once, she didn't argue, recognizing the wisdom in having someone prepared to defend the house if necessary. She positioned herself at a window that offered a clear view of the yard, the shotgun loaded and ready across her lap. The riders drew closer, and Beatrice felt her blood run cold as she recognized the lead figure, not Hargrove, as she had feared, but his nephew, Julian Hargrove, a young man with his uncle's cunning but none of his restraint. Behind him rode 4 men she didn't recognize, rough-looking types with the hard eyes of hired guns. Quentin stood his ground in the yard, Tom and Shorty flanking him on either side. Illy remained on the barn roof, a rifle now visible in his hands. Julian reined in his horse a few yards from where Quentin stood. "Yates," he called, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. "Got a message from my uncle." "Could have saved yourself the ride," Quentin replied evenly. "We got his message 2 days ago. Answer's still no." Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. "This is a different message." He nodded to one of his companions, who produced a document from his saddlebag. "Court order. You're diverting water illegally from the Phillips property. We're here to ensure compliance." "That's a lie," Quentin said flatly. "Our water rights are properly filed and documented. Your uncle knows that." Julian shrugged. "Paper says different. Signed by Judge Parker from Virginia City." Beatrice frowned. Judge Parker was known to be in Hargrove's pocket, but his jurisdiction didn't normally extend to Dillon. This was a blatant end run around Judge Wilson's authority. "Let me see this court order," Quentin demanded, holding out his hand. Julian nudged his horse forward, extending the document. As Quentin reached for it, the young Hargrove's other hand moved swiftly to his hip, drawing a revolver with practiced speed. "Now!" Julian shouted, and chaos erupted. The 4 men behind him drew weapons. Tom dove for cover behind a water trough. Shorty, quicker on the draw than anyone might have expected, had his gun out and firing before Julian's men could properly aim. From the barn roof, Illy's rifle cracked sharply. Quentin had anticipated the trap. Even as Julian drew, Quentin was already moving, dropping to one knee and drawing his own weapon in a fluid motion. His first shot caught Julian in the shoulder, spinning the young man in his saddle. Beatrice's heart hammered in her chest as she watched the gunfight unfold with terrifying speed. One of Hargrove's men toppled from his horse, felled by Illy's rifle. Another clutched his leg where Shorty's bullet had found its mark. Julian, wounded but still dangerous, wheeled his horse around, firing wildly as he retreated. In less than a minute, it was over. Julian and his remaining men galloped away, leaving one of their companions dead in the yard and another wounded and unconscious where he had fallen from his horse. Beatrice burst from the house, shotgun still in hand, running to where Quentin knelt beside Shorty. "Is he hurt?" she called, fear constricting her throat. "Grazed," Quentin replied, his voice tight as he examined a bloody furrow along Shorty's upper arm. "Nothing serious, but it needs cleaning." Illy descended from the barn roof, his young face pale but composed. Tom emerged from behind the water trough, miraculously unscathed. The wounded attacker lay groaning nearby, clutching a bloody thigh. "What do we do with him?" Tom asked, gesturing to the injured man. Quentin's expression was grim. "Patch him up enough to keep him alive, then take him to Sheriff Miller. He's our evidence of what really happened here." He looked to the dead man. "And him as well. The sheriff needs to see this." Beatrice knelt beside Quentin, setting the shotgun aside to help with Shorty's wound. "They came prepared to kill," she said quietly, the reality of how close she had come to losing everything, to losing Quentin washing over her in sickening waves. "Yes," Quentin agreed, his voice equally low. This wasn't about water rights. This was Hargrove's answer to our refusal. His eyes met hers, filled with a cold determination she had never seen before. But it's his last move. This ends now. The aftermath of the shootout unfolded with surprising swiftness. Sheriff Miller, upon receiving the wounded man, the body, and their account of events, rode immediately to the Phillips property with a deputy. There they found Julian Hargrove being treated for his shoulder wound by a doctor who had been summoned from Dillon. Faced with multiple witnesses and physical evidence, Miller had no choice but to arrest Julian for attempted murder. The wounded hired gun, hoping for leniency, readily admitted they had been paid to provoke a confrontation and eliminate obstacles to Frederick Hargrove's plans. Hargrove himself professed shock and dismay at his nephew's actions, claiming no knowledge of the plot. But Judge Wilson, now fully aware of the extent of Hargrove's manipulations, was unconvinced. He issued an injunction preventing any further work on the Phillips property water diversion and opened an investigation into Hargrove's banking practices. The Carson Place auction proceeded as scheduled in mid-May. To their surprise, Quentin and Beatrice faced no competition for the property. Hargrove, under increasing legal scrutiny and with his nephew awaiting trial, had apparently abandoned his expansion plans, at least temporarily. "It's not over," Quentin cautioned as they signed the final papers transferring ownership of the Carson property to them. "Men like Hargrove don't surrender easily." "No," Beatrice agreed, "but he's wounded, and we're stronger than ever." The truth of her words extended beyond their land holdings. The ranch was flourishing under their joint management. The spring calving had produced a healthy crop of new stock. The garden was yielding abundantly. The new barn stood solid and strong, larger and better designed than its predecessor. Most importantly, their marriage had evolved from a pragmatic arrangement into a deep and abiding love. They worked side by side during the day, planned and dreamed together in the evenings, and shared the quiet intimacy of their bed at night. What had begun as a desperate moment on a cliff's edge had blossomed into something neither could have imagined on that rain-soaked day nearly a year ago. The following winter brought news that Frederick Hargrove had sold his interests in Dillon and relocated to San Francisco, his banking empire in Montana having crumbled under judicial investigation. Julian had been sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison for his role in the attempted murder. "You think Hargrove will try to come back someday?" Beatrice asked as they sat before the fire on a snowy evening, the first anniversary of their true marriage having just passed. Quentin considered the question. "Possibly, but he'll find a different Dillon if he does. People here have seen his true nature now." He smiled at her. "Besides, we'll be ready if he does." She nestled closer to him on the sofa. "Yes, we will." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by a cry from the cradle near the fire, a demanding wail that brought immediate smiles to both their faces. "Your son has your timing," Beatrice observed wryly as she rose to attend to the 2-month-old infant. "Always making his presence known just when things get comfortable." Quentin watched as she lifted little William Thomas Yates from his cradle, cradling him with practiced ease. "And your determination," he countered, "never gives up until he gets exactly what he wants." As if to prove the point, William's cries subsided the moment Beatrice settled back beside Quentin, the baby cradled between them. His tiny fingers wrapped around Quentin's offered thumb with surprising strength. "He's going to be a fine rancher someday," Quentin said softly, wonder still evident in his voice whenever he looked at his son. "Of course he is," Beatrice agreed. "He has us to teach him." Outside, snow fell gently across the expanded Yates Ranch, covering the land that stretched from the river to the distant foothills. Inside, firelight bathed the family in golden warmth, illuminating the love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning, a desperate woman on a cliff's edge, and the cowboy who had pulled her back, who had kept his promise never to let go. As William drifted back to sleep between them, Quentin pressed a kiss to Beatrice's temple. "Thank you," he murmured. "For what?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "For giving me a reason to stay, for turning this place into a home." His arm tightened around her shoulders. "For everything." Beatrice turned her face to his, their lips meeting in a kiss that still held the wonder of new discovery alongside the comfort of deep familiarity. "Thank you," she whispered against his mouth, "for pulling me back from the edge, for never letting go." In the quiet of their home, with their son sleeping peacefully between them and the future stretching bright before them, they shared a moment of perfect understanding, two people who had saved each other in every way that mattered, whose love had transformed not just their lives but the very land they called home. Outside the window, the first star of evening appeared through a break in the clouds, a silent witness to the enduring power of a love that had begun with a desperate act of rescue and grown into something as vast and enduring as the Montana sky itself.